When the cabin door flew open, I didn't move. I just sat at the table, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already lost its warmth. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. Quiet except for the creak of the door and the ragged breathing of the woman who burst through it. Sunlight crawled lazily across the wooden floorboards, glinting off the dust that danced in the stillness. I'd been expecting this interruption. Not her exactly, but someone like her. She looked like every self-appointed guardian of order I'd ever met. Posture stiff with entitlement, voice sharpened by years of gossip and unchecked power. Her lipstick was too bright for the forest light, her blouse too crisp for the mud outside. And in her trembling hand, she clutched a wrinkled paper with the confidence of someone who thought ink and bluster could bend reality. I didn't rise. I just watched, calm and waiting, as authority tried to disguise insecurity. She stood framed in the doorway, sunlight cutting her silhouette into something sharp and intrusive. The forest light behind her caught the dust in the air, turning it into gold flecks that drifted lazily around the edges of her outline. In contrast, she looked rigid, almost metallic, a human interruption in a world built for stillness. The paper in her hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the strain of pretending to command authority. Her breath came fast, driven by indignation that had nowhere to land, the kind born from habit rather than reason. I recognized the type instantly, people who mistake control for purpose, who believe that order exists only when they are the ones defining it. For her, rules were not protection. They were scaffolding to hide behind. She clung to them the way some people cling to faith, loud enough to silence the doubt whispering underneath. The smell of her perfume, floral, expensive and out of place, cut through the cabin's calm like static through silence. I said nothing. Silence is a mirror, and she couldn't stand her reflection. The longer I stayed still, the more her certainty unraveled. She began to move around the room, her eyes darting to the corners as if authority might appear between the knots of pine and justify her intrusion. Her heels struck the wooden floor in quick, clipped beats that didn't belong here. Each step sounded like punctuation in a story she wasn't invited to tell. The room didn't bend to her will. It absorbed her noise and gave her nothing back. I watched her without judgment, only curiosity. Some people enter rooms like storms, convinced that noise equals meaning. But the cabin had its own rhythm, patient, unhurried, untouched by performance. She tried to fill the air with dominance, but it wasn't dominance I heard. It was desperation wearing perfume, echoing through walls too old to be impressed. Eventually, she slapped the paper onto the table between us. The edges were torn, the ink smudged from sweaty hands, the official seal crooked and cheap. It was the kind of counterfeit authority that relied on panic more than proof. I let my eyes drift over it without touching. Even from a distance, it reeked of arrogance. A declaration typed in bold, pretending to be law. I'd seen hundreds like it before, in offices, in city hearings, in quiet attempts to intimidate. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, a low whisper against the tension in the room. She stood there, waiting for outrage or surrender, mistaking my calm for submission. What she didn't understand was that power isn't loud. It's patient. True power doesn't shout orders. It collects facts, gathers silence, and waits for the right moment to strike. The notice lay between us like a confession, and I knew the storm had only just begun. Across from me sat the man who had arrived earlier that morning. Quiet, measured, observant in the way that people become when silence is their preferred weapon. His stillness wasn't passive. It was the kind that holds the room without effort. The calm that waits not to be invited, but to be revealed. Everything about him was composed. His breathing, the placement of his hands, the slow rhythm of his gaze as it followed the woman's every movement. He didn't need to interrupt her chaos. He simply allowed it to echo until it began to sound absurd. His presence carried a density that didn't need a name. He had the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime listening to people convict themselves. Not the impatience of judgment, but the patience of inevitability. His glasses caught the light as he turned his head slightly, reflecting the faint shimmer of the fire behind me. Outside, wind threaded through the pines, and the crow's call returned once before fading completely, like punctuation at the end of an unfinished sentence. The woman didn't notice. She was too busy performing righteousness in a room that had already decided to stop applauding. I stayed where I was, fingers tracing the rim of my coffee cup, the cold liquid inside long since surrendered to stillness. There was a rhythm to this moment, slow, deliberate, heavy with consequence. I realized that control wasn't loud, it was quiet, like the soft click of a lock turning or the slow inhale before a verdict. She didn't yet understand that she'd entered a space no longer hers to command. Authority recognizes its predator, even before the mind catches up. The air itself seemed to shift in allegiance, bending subtly toward the man across from me. The woman's anger began to falter under the weight of his silence. Her certainty flickered, searching for a foothold in a room that had stopped listening. I let the scene unfold with the detachment of someone who already knows the outcome. The fire snapped once, a small, sharp sound that felt like the world confirming what I already understood. I had invited calm into this cabin, but calm, as I was learning, had teeth. It took her several minutes to notice him properly. When she finally did, the color drained from her face, just slightly, like a shadow passing over glass. Her eyes flicked between us, confusion warring with defiance. She had come expecting a man she could intimidate. Instead, she'd walked into a storm wrapped in patience and authority. Her hand trembled as she tried to straighten the fake document, to resurrect her crumbling performance. I watched the transformation. Indignation curdling into unease, bravado into calculation. She wanted to retreat but couldn't. Pride had built her too small a cage. The silence pressed in, and somewhere deep down, she must have understood that she'd stepped far beyond her depth. In that moment, I almost pitied her. Not for her arrogance, but for how completely she believed it was power. Her composure cracked the way thin ice does. Slowly at first, then all at once, the anger faded, replaced by a strange, rehearsed calm. She straightened her cardigan, softened her voice, and began to pretend the intrusion was a misunderstanding. I had seen that mask before, the fragile politeness people wear when cornered. She spoke about concern for community safety, about protocols, about anything that might make her trespass sound noble, but her eyes betrayed her. They flickered between the man across the table and the door, already searching for an escape she hadn't earned. The smell of burnt coffee lingered, bitter and grounding, while I watched her dig herself deeper with every word. The man across the table finally reached for the paper. His movements were deliberate, not slow, not hurried, but carrying the inevitability of someone who already knew what he would find. When his fingers touched the crumpled sheet, the air in the cabin seemed to pause, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Dust drifted through the slanted beam of sunlight, moving lazily between us like time refusing to interfere. He unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing its edges with a precision that turned the act into ritual. The faint rasp of his fingertips against the cheap fiber was the only sound. Then he studied the forged seal, the faded emblem printed in imitation of legitimacy, and traced its outline once with the kind of stillness that weighs more than anger. His silence had gravity. It pressed down on the room until every shallow breath felt audible. The woman shifted, her body language betraying what her mouth refused to admit. Her shoulders drew tighter, her hands knotted together as if she could squeeze truth back into hiding. The color drained from her face, leaving behind something brittle. The look of someone realizing that the mask she'd worn had begun to crack, and everyone could hear it. Sunlight moved across the table and struck the page, revealing every imperfection that arrogance had missed. The letterhead was unevenly cut. The ink bled at the corners where sweat had blurred imitation into parody. The official seal, once meant to intimidate, now looked like a child's drawing held up to a magnifying glass. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Silence became the verdict, and in that stillness, justice revealed its truest form. Not thunderous, not theatrical, but precise and suffocating. I watched him set the paper down with the care one gives to evidence, not accusation. In that moment, I remembered something I'd nearly forgotten. Justice, when real, doesn't roar. It breathes. And that day, I could hear it breathing in that room. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the forged document pressed against her composure until it fractured. Words spilled from her, not in sentences, but in broken pieces. She insisted she hadn't acted alone, that she was told what to do, that this was never her plan. I listened, noting every tremor, every desperate justification. Fear had replaced arrogance, and in its place came something raw and human. Guilt. I realized then that she wasn't the architect of this corruption, only a messenger who had finally read her own lie aloud. It didn't absolve her, but it made her small, almost pitiable. And beneath her panic, I could already feel a larger presence waiting to step into the light. Her confession wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real story. The name she whispered changed everything. There was someone above her, someone who believed himself untouchable, someone who used people like her as chess pieces to expand control disguised as order. The man across the table looked up from the notice, and I saw the shift in his expression, from patience to intent. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was something bigger, older, and dirtier. The woman stood trembling, realizing she had exposed more than deceit. She had pointed a finger at power itself. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before thunder. The sound came first. Slow footsteps on the wooden porch, steady and deliberate. The door opened not with a crash, but with certainty. A man stepped inside, tall, polished, his suit too perfect for the wilderness around us. He carried authority like perfume, strong, artificial, designed to mask decay. The woman flinched at his presence, shrinking into herself. He surveyed the room with ownership in his eyes, the kind that doesn't see people, only territory. The light from the lake flickered against the glass behind him, casting shifting shadows on the walls. And as he crossed the threshold, I knew the quiet game had ended. This was the moment the real war began. The air inside the cabin changed the instant he entered. It wasn't the temperature, it was the gravity. He carried the kind of confidence that only comes from years of unchecked control, the arrogance of someone who has always been obeyed. Every step he took sounded rehearsed, deliberate, like an actor who believed the stage belonged to him. The woman straightened, trying to recover her dignity under his gaze, but it was too late. He barely looked at her. His focus was fixed on us, on the man across the table, and on me. Two worlds collided in that small room. His built on intimidation, ours on truth. And for the first time, I saw his certainty flicker when he realized he was no longer the one dictating the rules. He moved like a shadow that believed itself invincible. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with the faint smoke of the fire as he began to circle the table, claiming space without a word. Behind him, the cabin door opened again, and two men stepped in, large, silent, wearing ordinary clothes that made their presence even more menacing. They didn't need to speak. Their weight was the message. The woman's breath hitched, her earlier defiance evaporating. I sat still, my pulse steady, watching arrogance dress itself as power for the last time. True danger doesn't announce itself loudly. It smiles and waits for obedience. But I wasn't there to obey. I was there to watch that smile crack. It happened almost imperceptibly, the faint blink of a red light in the far corner of the cabin. He hadn't noticed it yet, too consumed by his own performance. But I knew it was there, recording every word, every movement, every flicker of corruption laid bare in the dim light. I had installed those cameras weeks ago, when the harassment began, not out of paranoia, but instinct. The law doesn't always arrive when you call it. Sometimes you have to bring it with you. The man across from me hadn't moved, but his eyes had found the light too. That single flickering dot turned the cabin from a trap into a witness, and for the first time, I felt the scales shift in silence. It took only a few seconds for realization to strike him. That faint red glow reflected in his own eyes. Control drained from his posture like air from a punctured tire. The arrogance fractured, replaced by something raw and uncertain. The woman gasped, covering her mouth while his men froze, their loyalty faltering in the face of exposure. There's a unique kind of silence that follows discovery, heavy, electric, final. It filled the room as he stood there, jaw tight, every lie he'd built trembling beneath the weight of recorded truth. He had come here to claim ownership, but the moment that light blinked, the land, the story, the power, none of it belonged to him anymore. Time slowed into stillness. The suited man's pulse was visible in the vein at his temple, his jaw clenched hard enough to splinter teeth. The two men by the door shifted uneasily, waiting for an order that would never come. Across the table, calm remained unbroken, the quiet kind that carries the authority of inevitability. No shouting, no chaos, just the slow, methodical collapse of a man realizing he's been cornered by his own arrogance. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, indifferent to human pride. Outside, the forest stood witness, ancient, unmoved, patient. The war he thought he'd won had ended before it began, and all that was left now was the silence that follows justice when it stops pretending to be polite. At first, it was only a faint hum, a vibration on the edge of hearing that could have been the wind winding through the trees, or the lake sighing against the shore. But it grew, slowly, methodically, layered with the pulse of engines and the rhythm of precision. Authority was approaching, not the self-proclaimed kind that swaggered and demanded obedience, but the kind that didn't need to shout. Blue and red lights began to flicker through the cracks of the shutters, restless color bleeding across the wooden walls, pulsing like a heartbeat that didn't belong to the house. The man's composure fractured under the weight of inevitability. His once practiced calm turned brittle, the mask of superiority crumbling with each passing second. Power built on fear always collapses at the sound of truth coming closer. He looked smaller now, a figure stripped of pretense, reduced to the simple fact of consequence. The woman beside him slid down the wall, her trembling hands covering her face as if darkness could hide her from the light. The papers she'd brought earlier lay scattered across the floor, their false authority exposed by the very glow that seeped through the window panes. Outside, tires crackled on gravel, a sound too measured to belong to panic. The hum of engines settled into formation, organized, deliberate, unstoppable. Somewhere in the distance, radios murmured and doors slammed, the kind of orchestrated chaos that signals order taking back control. The night, once thick with threat, now carried the pulse of restoration. Even the forest seemed to lean in, listening. I didn't move from my chair. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing in rhythm with the lights outside, red for warning, blue for redemption. It painted the room in alternating truths, what was false and what remained. The air vibrated with the tension of endings, but beneath it was something purer, steadier. Justice has a sound if you listen closely, not the clash of sirens or boots, but the quiet certainty that follows them. For the first time in weeks, the pounding in my chest slowed, syncing with the steady heartbeat of safety returning to the world. The door opened, and the night flooded in, sharp, cold, honest. Deputies moved with the certainty of those who had been waiting for this moment. The man who once spoke like a king now stood motionless, his voice gone brittle, his arrogance draining into the floorboards. Handcuffs glinted in the firelight as they caught his wrists, clicking shut with final precision. The forest seemed to listen, the sound of the metal echoing deeper than it should have. His empire of intimidation ended not with shouting, but with silence. The woman wept quietly in the corner, her tears cutting streaks through the remnants of her pride. The law had walked through the same door she once used for intrusion, and this time it stayed. When the chaos faded, what remained was emptiness. The woman sat on the floor beside the dying fire, clutching the fake notice like a relic of her undoing. The flames danced weakly, casting fractured light across her face, a portrait of remorse painted too late. I felt no triumph watching her, only the strange stillness that follows the end of something toxic. Outside, the voices of officers grew distant as they loaded the last car. The world felt heavier and lighter at once. Justice never feels like victory. It feels like exhale, the quiet after holding your breath too long. I closed the door gently, and for the first time, the cabin belonged entirely to silence. We stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, the kind that carries sound cleanly across water. The lake below reflected the last flashes of red and blue before dissolving into calm darkness. The attorney beside me stood still, his presence solid and unspoken. Somewhere behind us, the cabin glowed faintly, a beacon against the night. I thought about the cost of peace, how it never comes freely, how it must be earned one confrontation at a time. The stars were sharp, clear, honest. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe without fear of interruption. Justice wasn't loud, it was steady, like the rhythm of the water lapping against the shore. Morning rose like forgiveness. Golden light spilled over the pine crowns, catching the mist as it lifted from the lake in pale ribbons that shimmered before dissolving into warmth. The cabin, once a fortress of tension, stood humbled by the new day, smaller, quieter, almost shy beneath the sun. I stepped onto the porch with a fresh cup of coffee, its steam curling into the cool air like breath returning after too long underwater. The world was still but not empty. It pulsed with quiet life, every sound deliberate. The creak of wood, the soft rhythm of water against the shore, the distant hum of waking birds. I watched sunlight slide across the lake, turning ripples into gold, the same light that had once illuminated confrontation and fear. It felt different now, softer, earned. Power built on fear fades, peace built on integrity endures. The morning light didn't expose anymore, it restored. And in that restoration, I finally felt whole.